So let's plunge into the continuation of the chapter then. We're starting at verse 16, which we read very briefly. Now we read here about the first fruits. The first fruits be holy, then the lump is also holy. It seems to be talking about dough, apparently. The idea of this lump, it's a lump of dough. And the meaning really is that if the first fruit, if the selection from this lump of dough is holy, then the lump itself must be holy. The lump of dough itself must be holy. And then he repeats the idea, but it's the other way around, rather. So that if the root is holy, so are the branches. So that there's the root, which is a more central part of the tree, obviously. If that's holy, the branches are also holy. So that's the relationship between the core or the root of the thing and the offspring of it, like the branches are the offspring of the root. And if the root is holy, the branches are also holy. Now then you look at verse 17, and if some of the branches were broken off, and thou, talking to Gentiles now, and thou, being a wild olive tree, because that's what Gentiles are, wert graft in among them, and with them partakest of the root and fatness of the olive tree. It's going on to say, don't boast. So we've got here this reference to branches being broken off. We'll speak in a moment about not boasting. That's a really important thing so far as Gentiles are concerned, to have the right attitude. We'll come back to that in a second. Just want to pick up this idea of the natural branches of this olive tree being broken off. That's really a reference to, there's an olive tree, by the way, an Israeli olive tree. So you see what that looks like. But this reference to branches being broken off goes back to Jeremiah 11. It's worth having a look at that, because it picks up some of the other ideas that we've been speaking about when we looked at this 11th chapter. So Jeremiah chapter 11, verse 16. That's where the quote's taken from. So Jeremiah 11 and 16. The Lord called thy name a green olive tree. This is speaking to Israel. Call thy name a green olive tree, fair and of goodly fruit. With the noise of a great tumult, he hath kindled fire upon it, and his branches of it are broken. So that was really what the apostles is hinting back at this passage from Jeremiah chapter 11, where Israel is likened to a good olive tree, but because of the way Israel's behaved, the branches are going to be broken off. So it was predicted all those years back in the days of Jeremiah. Now, there's quite a few interesting little features of this chapter that I'd just perhaps like to draw your attention to. First of all, verse 4, and there's the issue. The issue there is, who are God's people? I shall just read verse 4, which I commanded your fathers in the day that I brought them forth out of the land of Egypt, from the iron furnace, that's Egypt, saying, obey my voice. That's what he wanted them to do. Obey my voice and do them, commandments, according to all which I command you. So shall ye be my people, and I will be your God. Now that's an important idea in this 11th chapter of the letter to the Romans, and the 9th chapter as well, which we'll have a look at again in a minute. Ye shall be my people, I will be your God. That's the issue, isn't it? Who are God's people? And of what people is Yahweh the God? We'll come back to that verse shortly. What God wanted them to do, he wanted them to hear what he had to say. And he expresses that in verse 6. The Lord said to me, proclaim all these words to the cities of Judah and the streets of Jerusalem, saying, hear ye the words of this covenant and do them. That's what God wanted. He wanted them to listen to what he said and to do them. And then in verse 8 we read, yet they obeyed not, nor inclined their ear. So they didn't hear, and they didn't obey. They walked everyone the imagination of their evil heart. This was Israel. These are the natural branches of the good olive tree. And the result, therefore, in verse 14, because they wouldn't hear God, therefore verse 14, pray not for this people, neither lift up a cry or prayer for them, for I will not hear them in the time that they cry unto me for their trouble, because they refuse to hear him, that he wouldn't hear them. And that's shades, isn't it, of the ideas that we considered last time, where people refuse to hear and therefore become incapable of hearing, and their prayers are unheard, as it were, or apparently unheard. God hides himself from them. Rather like that reference we got from Matthew 13. Why do you speak in parables? Well, Jesus says, ears they have to hear, but they can't hear, and eyes have to see, but they can't see. Now, there's another interesting reference to this, is also from Jeremiah, which is a little bit later on in Lamentations. This sad situation that the prayers of God's own people would not penetrate to their God. We get it in Lamentations 3 and verse 44. This is what Jeremiah says of God: thou hast covered thyself with a cloud, that our prayer should not pass through. It was a tragic situation, that is, that God would not hear them because they had not heard him in the first place. That's the way God behaves towards his people. Now, we said we'd come back to the point that verse 17 was leading up to. Verse 17 was speaking about Gentiles being grafted into the good olive tree. Gentiles being naturally wild, not related to Israel, aliens from the Commonwealth of Israel, and yet graft in to this good olive tree, so that they can partake of the root and fatness of the olive tree. Because remember, if the root is holy, then so are the branches. So there's a source of holiness from the root to the branches. So the Apostle Paul is saying here. But very important, verse 18, don't boast. Don't be high-minded, but fear. Let's well, we could read all those verses actually. Perhaps let's just go back. Read down to verse 21 from verse 18. Boast not against the branches, but if thou boast, thou bearest not the root, but the root thee. That really means, but if thou boast, is you should remember, is it has the sense of just remember, you don't bear the root bears you. The goodness comes from the root, not the other way around. So there's no cause for the branches to boast. That they are sucking the benefit, as it were, from the root. Thou bearest not the root, but the root thee. That's the sense. And this, if thou boast, is perhaps a bit misleading. I think in some versions it's translated just remember. That's the idea of it. Thou wilt say then, the branches were broken off that I might be grafted in. It's a tendency that we might say, well, yes, these branches were broken off so that I can be grafted in. Well, there's a measure of truth in that. Well, because of unbelief, this is what they need to remember. Because of unbelief, they were broken off, and thou, these wild branches, thou standest by faith. There's that important idea, and again, thou standest by faith. Be not high-minded, but fear. High-minded. That's a Greek word, hupsolophronio. Phronio has to do with the mind, and hupsala has to do with being high, being exalted. Don't be high-minded, but fear. And in fact, the correct attitude is spoken of in the next chapter, in chapter 3, chapter 12 and verse 3. For I say, through the grace given me to every man that is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly, according as God hath dealt to every man the measure of faith. And that word soberly is sophronio. In other words, wise thinking, right thinking. So you've got this contrast between being high thinking, hupsolophronio, and sophronio. get your mind in the right place, is what the Apostle Paul is saying. And don't get to think that, oh, well, this has all happened for my benefit. You need to be very cautious. And if you remember where the source of goodness is, it's not the branches, it's the root that's really the source of benefit. Jesus spoke about the way the things of Israel would be taken from the natural inheritors of those things and given to something else. It's the end of Matthew chapter 21. It's just worth a look at, because Matthew 21, it's described as the kingdom of God, which will be taken from the natural inheritors of the kingdom of God, otherwise known as the children of the kingdom in some places. And the children of the kingdom, the natural inheritors of the kingdom, were the scribes, the Pharisees, the Jews. They were the natural inheritors of the things of the kingdom. But we read in verse 43 what Jesus says, because in verse 42 they'd rejected the stone which God provided, that is Jesus himself. Therefore, verse 43, I say unto you that the kingdom of God, the things of Israel, shall be taken from you and given to a nation bringing forth the fruits thereof. Whosoever shall fall on this stone, this is the one they'd rejected, shall be broken, which is what's going to happen to them. And on whomsoever it shall fall, it will grind him to powder. They fall and stumble. Remember, that idea comes in Romans 11, that they stumble. They're stumbling at Christ, and they will fall, but not forever. On whomsoever it shall fall, it will grind him to powder. And when the chief priests and Pharisees heard the parable, then they perceived that he spake of them. So they realized he was saying to them, oh, well, the things that you regard as your heritage is going to be taken from you and given to a nation bringing forth the fruits thereof. The nation, it's Greek ethnos, and it does have to do with another nation, generally a non-Jewish nation. So it was a pretty strong thing for Jesus to say to these Pharisees. But it's not unconditional. And so if we go back to Romans 11, we find that in verse 22, which we've not yet read, we've read verse 21, if God spared not the natural branches, these scribes and Pharisees, the children of the kingdom, as it were, take heed lest he also spare not thee. That's the danger, isn't it? And what's the condition for being spared? It is in verse 22. Behold, therefore, the goodness and the severity of God. God has two sides. On them which fell, severity. They stumbled and fell, as we read in Matthew chapter 21. But toward thee, goodness, but not unconditionally, if thou continue in his goodness, otherwise thou also shalt be cut off. So the things that God has vouchsafed to the Gentiles during this period of opportunity that they have, when the blindness has happened to the natural seed, the natural inheritors of these things, is conditional on maintaining that faith by which they were saved in the first place. And it's important, an important point that Paul is working towards, that the Jews, the natural Jews, that's the nation as in general, will be regrafted into the good olive tree. They won't be regrafted in unconditionally any more than the Gentiles will remain branches of the tree unconditionally. There will be conditions, and we'll have a look at them in just a moment. But if they adopt this attitude, verse 23, if they, that's the Jews, if they abide not still in unbelief, in other words, if they change their attitude, if to use the words of Leviticus 26, and I have walked contrary to them, if they take that attitude, then they can be regrafted, because God is able to regraft them. In fact, that's what it says, doesn't it, in verse 23? If they abide not still in unbelief, then they shall be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. Nothing is impossible with God, and God's purpose with his people will not be frustrated, as we saw last week. And then he goes on. Let's have a look. We've looked briefly at these two verses last week, but let's just read them again. For if thou, talking to the Gentiles now, cut out of the olive tree, which is wild by nature, so that's because these are the wild branches, and were graft contrary to nature into a good olive tree, it's the Israelitish one, how much more shall these which be the natural branches be grafted into their own olive tree? It's just saying, well, God can graft the natural branches in. If he's managed to graft in the wild branches, it's not going to be a major thing for him to graft in the natural branches again, but on his conditions. And that's how much more. That much more, remember, related that to the in verse 15, the concluding verse of that 15. If the casting away of them be the reconciling of the world, what should be the receiving of them be? That's the regrafting, but life from the dead. In other words, the dry bones being put together and life breathed into them, so that once more, as a nation, they can be brought to life in the sight of God. So, and then verse 25, I would not, brethren, that ye should be ignorant of this mystery. What's the mystery? We'll come to mysteries towards the end. Lest ye should be wise in your own conceits, that blindness in part is happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles be coming. So this blindness, this hardness of heart, is not permanent. And there will come a time when the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. There'll be a period of the Gentile time, the times of the Gentiles. And maybe we'll hear about that on Saturday, on the prophecy day, because the times of the Gentiles is one of the subjects. The fullness of the Gentiles be come in. And when that happens, we have this change in the position of the natural branches of the Israelitish olive tree. And the result of that is, if we look at the next couple of verses, so all Israel shall be saved. As it is written, they shall come out of Zion, the deliverer, and shall turn away ungodliness from Jacob. All Israel shall be saved. That is, both the Jewish and the Gentile components of Israel will be saved. Let's just read on the next two verses. For this is my covenant unto them, when I shall take away their sins. That's really important, isn't it? It's a covenant that he would take away their sins. As concerning the gospel, they are enemies. They, the Jews, that is, are enemies for your sakes, the Gentiles' sakes. But as touching the election, then they are beloved for the Father's sake. The election, of course, are the faithful ones that would hear. And so they're beloved for the Father's sakes, the election. So let's just think about that. There's a quotation there from Isaiah, and we'll have a look at that in a minute. But there's an important idea, isn't it? That the sins can be taken away. It was the sins in the first place, as we read in Jeremiah 11, that caused the branches of that good olive tree that should have been bringing forth good fruit to be cut off, to be removed. And so if the sin can be removed, then the conditions for regrafting will be fulfilled. That is a necessary condition for being grafted in again. The sins have to be removed. They have to be taken away. Let's just go, we'll spend a bit of time thinking about that and looking at other references to that. But just to remind ourselves where this quotation comes from, it's Isaiah 59. And it's an interesting one here because it seems slightly different from the way it's quoted. There seems to be a slight difference of emphasis. Notice the sense where we've just quoted it is that he turns away ungodliness from Jacob. That's the that was the sense in which we read it there. So if we go to Isaiah 59, I'll have a look at what that says. Isaiah 59. verse 20. This speaks about the Redeemer coming. So the Redeemer shall come to Zion, and unto them that turn from transgression in Jacob, saith the Lord. That's what's being quoted. It seems to be put slightly differently in the way it's quoted. It's those who turn away ungodliness from Jacob, but the effect is the same. It's those who are prepared for their ungodliness to be reversed, isn't it? He comes to those who are prepared for their ungodliness to be undone, for their sins to be forgiven. And that's what he says earlier in Isaiah in the 27th chapter. And the 9th verse. By this, therefore, shall the iniquity of Jacob be purged. And this is all the fruit. And this is all the fruit to take away his sin, when he maketh all the stones of the altars a chalk stone that are beaten in sunder. The groves and the images shall not stand up. The important thing is that the iniquity of Jacob must be purged. He must take away his sin. That's what has to happen before the conditions are met for the regrafting process. And that was foreseen, wasn't it, a long time ago by Balaam, when Balaam, it wasn't his own idea, but in Numbers chapter 23, this is the speech of Balaam, who was hired, if you remember, to curse Israel, but 3 times, and he stood up intending to curse. He was unable to do it. He blessed Israel because God put in his mouth what he had to say, even though he would rather have liked to curse Israel so he could gain the reward from Balak. But if we look at verse 20 of chapter 23, this is what Balaam says. All Israel assembled before him. He says, "Behold, I have received commandment to bless, and he hath blessed, and I cannot reverse it. He hath not beheld iniquity in Jacob, neither hath he seen perverseness in Israel. The Lord his God is with him, and a shout of a king is among them." That's remarkable. That's the effect of God turning an ungodliness away from Jacob. I have not beheld iniquity in Jacob. It's the sense that their sins will be removed. There's another reference which I'd like to look at. It's towards the end of the prophecy of Micah, which very graphically illustrates what God will do and how he will fulfill this promise. This is very near the end of the prophecy of Micah, and the 18th verse of chapter 7. Who is a God like unto thee? That's actually Micah's name. Who is a God like unto thee that pardoneth iniquity? That's what's important to Israel, because they've been uprooted from their natural tree because of sin, because of iniquity. But their God is one who can forgive iniquity, that pardoneth iniquity, and passeth by the transgression of the remnant of his heritage. There's this idea of an election, a remnant of his heritage. He retaineth not his anger forever, because he delighteth in mercy, because he is a merciful God, full of goodness and truth. He will turn again. He will have compassion on us. This is Israel. He will subdue our iniquities. And thou wilt cast all their sins into the depths of the sea. Why? Well, thou wilt perform the truth to Jacob and thy mercy to Abraham, which thou hast sworn unto our fathers from the days of old. It's because God had sworn to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and to David, that he would look after their descendants. And that's what God would do. He won't do it in any sort of defiance of his righteousness, but he will do it as he has promised. And it corresponds to the regrafting of the Israelitish branches into their tree, their natural tree. But they can't be regrafted until their iniquities are forgiven, until the sins are forgiven. And that's a really important element in the whole process. However, we're wanting to make the point, there is still to be this purging process. And it's quite important. If we go back to Ezekiel chapter 20, that when Israel, the nation of Israel, as it were, are brought to the borders of the land, then they experience this process of, it's called pleading in the Authorized Version, in the King James Version, but it's to do with a judgment. So in verse 35, I will bring you, says God, into the wilderness of the people, and there will I plead with you face to face. Like as I pleaded with your fathers in the wilderness, in the land of Egypt, so will I plead with you, saith the Lord God. And I will cause you to pass under the rod, and I will bring you into the bond of the covenant. And I will purge out from among you the rebels, and them that transgress against me. And I will bring them forth out of the country where they sojourn, and they shall not enter into the land of Israel. And ye shall know that I am the Lord. So it isn't indiscriminate so far as the nation is concerned. Their sins are to be forgiven, but he says he will purge out the rebels. So you have this another election, another choice of God, and it's described here as those who pass under the rod. So it's like passing under the rod. What's the significance of passing under the rod? Well, we find out about that in Leviticus, last chapter of Leviticus, and it links us back to something we were talking about last week that we had from Isaiah chapter 6. And if you remember, there was the very last verse of Isaiah chapter 6. So if we have a look at Leviticus chapter 27 and verse 32. Concerning the tithe of the herd or of the flock, even of whatsoever passeth under the rod, the 10th shall be holy unto the Lord. So there's the significance of passing under the rod. It produces a 10th or a tithe or an election, a remnant, holy to God. It is wholly preserved for God. And that's what God intends to do with the nation as a whole. In a sense, he's done it on an individual basis in the first century, when there were disciples who did hear, the poor of the flock who knew it was the word of the Lord, and they believed, and they were an election. But here we have another election, those who are left after this purging process, when God will purge out the rebels who will not enter into the land. Whereas the election, the selection, the tithe will enter into the land, but it will be a national tithe now, not just an individual tithe. And so all Israel shall be saved. We have that in that 26th. Israel is saved. Oh, sorry, it's 26th verse of Romans 11. And we know the importance of that idea that they are not all Israel who are of Israel, because some of Israel are adopted and some of Israel are natural, but all Israel must be saved, Jewish and Gentile components of Israel. And we don't need to turn to that. I don't think we've looked at that before. Chapter 9, not all Israel who are of Israel. So it's both Jew and Gentile. However, let's have a closer look at this idea of my people. Who are my people and who are not my people? That it was actually touched on in the 9th chapter of Romans, and just go back to that. Verse 24. Even us, he says, who he hath called, not of the Jews only, but also of the Gentiles. So you've got Jewish and Gentile. As he saith also in Hosea, and now he quotes from Hosea chapter 2, I will call them my people, which were not my people, and her beloved that was not beloved. Right, that's Hosea chapter 2, which we'll look at in a minute. And then in verse 26, he makes another quotation, which sounds quite similar. And it shall come to pass that in the place where it was said unto them, ye are not my people, there shall they be called the children of the living God. Now, if we look back in Hosea, you find that those two things don't mean the same. They're not saying the same thing. So going back to Hosea, the first quotation was from Hosea chapter 2. And if we look at the context of Hosea chapter 2, you can see that it's talking about the restoration of God's people. So in verse 20, for example, I will even betroth thee unto me. Perhaps I should move on. Verse 20, I will betroth thee unto me in faithfulness. Thou shalt know the law. It shall come to pass in that day. I will hear, saith the Lord, I will hear. And then he goes on to speak about, in verse 23, and I will sow her unto me in the earth, and I will have mercy upon her, that is now the nation of Israel, that have not obtained mercy because they were unfaithful. And I will say to her that were not my people, Israel, thou art my people, and they shall say, thou art my God. So that's what that seems to mean in the context of Hosea chapter 2. But the other reference is from Hosea chapter 1 and verse 10, where the context is clearly the other way around. In verse 10, yet the number of the children of Israel shall be as the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured nor numbered. It shall come to pass that in the place where it was said unto them, ye, as Gentiles, ye are not my people, there it shall be said unto them, ye, Gentiles, are the sons of the living God. And that's, if you look at the context of chapter 1, it's the condemnation of Israel. So once the condemnation of Israel, one is the restoration of Israel. And that's interesting, isn't it? Because those are the two issues that the Apostle Paul is dealing with in the letter to the Romans. A temporary time when God's people, the Jews, ceased to be God's people because of the way they behaved. And he is going to call a nation who were not previously his people, that is Gentiles. They can be his people through adoption. But there will come a time when the roles will be reversed, and he will call those whom he had previously cast off, Jews, he will call them his people. And that's quite a strong idea. It comes into Jeremiah. Well, we've already seen a hint of it in Jeremiah chapter 11 and verse 4, but it's very clear in Jeremiah 31 that this is what God is going to do in order to restore his people, the natural branches of the olive tree. And so in verse 33 of Jeremiah 31, we realize, this shall be the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, saith the Lord. I will put my law in their inward parts, I'll write it in their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. So that there's an assurance that God gives that he will put away their iniquities, and they will be his people. He will be their God again, and they shall be his people again. That's what he wanted all the time, isn't it? That was his intention right from the time when he brought them out of Egypt. He said that you were a peculiar people, a special treasure, a holy nation, a kingdom of priests, that they were God's people. And for a time, they'd been cast off because of their iniquity. The branches have been plucked out. Chance for the Gentiles to jump in, as it were, and gain some goodness from the Israelitish olive tree, only until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. It's a wonderful day of opportunity for us, isn't it? So, going back to Romans 11 then, getting a bit closer to the end, Romans chapter 11 and start looking at verse 28. So we've looked at this question of the people, God's people, and God being the God of his people. So let's have a look at verse 28. Concerning the gospel, this is the Jews, are enemies for your sakes, that's the Gentiles, but as touching the election, they are beloved for the Father's sakes. We've read that verse, but verse 29 now. For the gifts and calling of God are without repentance. So God's purpose isn't going to be frustrated permanently. For as ye, that's Gentiles, in time past have not believed God, because we're wild olives, yet have now obtained mercy through the Jews, unbelief, even so have these Jews, that is, also now not believed, that through your mercy, that is the mercy shown to you, the mercy shown to Gentiles by God, they, the Jews, also may obtain mercy. There's a that translation, your mercy, is a bit misleading, and it's better rendered the mercy shown to you, and it is in some other versions. It's the mercy shown to you, the mercy shown to the Gentiles. The Gentiles have had some of the mercy which was originally given to the children of Israel, shown to them. But that the Jews will one day be recipients of that same mercy, the mercy that had been shown to the Gentiles, so that all Israel can be saved. Perhaps, yeah, we should read verse 32, shouldn't we? For God hath concluded them all in unbelief, that he might have mercy upon all. So both Jews and Gentiles have at some stage in their careers been guilty of unbelief. Just as it shows in the early chapters of the letter to the Romans, the first and through to the third chapter, all the world is guilty before God, both Jew and Gentile. What things soever the law saith, it saith to them that are under the law, that all the world, all flesh may be condemned. And that means that God can have mercy on all, both Jew and Gentile, because both parties have at some time been out of favor and in a position of condemnation. And so verse 32, God hath concluded them all, Jew and Gentile, in unbelief, that he might have mercy upon all. So it's a way of God manifesting his mercy. His mercy is made even more obvious by the fact that it's dispensed both to the natural children and to the adopted children. So the mercy of God is so beneficial to all mankind, whether they're Jewish or non-Jewish. And then there's a concluding section of just a few verses which are really profound and beautiful. If you just want to finish with these verses, it takes us up to the end of the chapter. I'll just read them. Oh, the depth of the riches, both of the wisdom and the knowledge of God! How unsearchable are his judgments, and his ways past finding out. For who hath known the mind of the Lord, or who hath been his counselor, or who hath first given to him, and it shall be recompensed unto him again? For of him, and through him, and to him are all things, to whom be glory for ever. Amen. So be it. Opposite of, God forbid, opposite of by no means. Here is something that is absolutely true, and in contrast with the casting off of his people. He will have mercy on all, but all this is unsearchable. And it's interesting that this section here about the verse 34, who hath known the mind of the Lord, it's really a quotation from Isaiah chapter 40, which is worth having a look at. Isaiah 40 verse 13. So, who hath directed the Spirit of the Lord? These are the words really that Paul is referring to. Who hath directed the Spirit of the Lord, or who being his counselor hath taught him? With whom took he counsel, and who instructed him, and taught him in the path of judgment, and taught him knowledge, and showed to him the way of understanding? That's the same question, isn't it? And just look across to verse 6 that we see there, the reference to this voice that cries, what shall I cry? All flesh is grass, and all the goodliness thereof is the flower of the field. It's Jew and Gentile, all flesh, Jew and Gentile flesh. That's like the beginning of the letter to the Romans. All the world guilty before God. All flesh is grass. In other words, it perishes. And who's known? Who could have foreseen what God had planned? That's really the idea. There's another reference in the Psalm 33. And 11th verse. This is a psalm that refers to God as a creator of heaven and earth by the word of the Lord, were the heavens made. But in verse 11 we read there, The counsel of the Lord standeth forever, the thoughts of his heart to all generations. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord, and the people whom he hath chosen for his own inheritance. There's this idea of choice again, this idea of election. And it's all to do with the counsel of the Lord, which stands forever. It's not going to be frustrated by apparent setbacks in the course of history, which it may have appeared to be in the casting off of the Jews. There's another reference we probably have time to look at in Psalm 92, which speaks about the depth, how deep are God's thoughts. What about this idea of unsearchable? It's quite an important idea because that's where we start. The unsearchable are his judgments and his ways past finding out. Well, if they're past finding out, does that mean we can't know about them? Well, no, it doesn't. And in fact, if we look at the letters of the Ephesians, third chapter of the letters of the Ephesians, we find there's another reference to the unsearchable nature of God's purpose. This is Ephesians 3, verse 8. Unto whom, this is the Apostle Paul speaking, unto whom the least of all saints is this grace given, that I should preach among the Gentiles the unsearchable riches of Christ. Things that are unsearchable. And in fact, we can see what he's referring to a little bit earlier in the chapter. Verse 3, how that by revelation he made known to me the mystery, as I wrote afore in few words, whereby when you read you may understand, which in other ages was not made known unto the sons of men, as it is now revealed. Oh, it's a revealed mystery unto his holy apostles and prophets by the Spirit. In other words, men like Paul. What is this mystery? That the Gentiles should be fellow heirs and of the same body and partakers of the promise in Christ by the gospel. And he refers to the fact that he's a minister of that. That was the mystery. That was the unsearchable thing. It was unsearchable by unaided man. Man would never have thought of it. It has to be revealed. And that's an important principle in the scriptures, that we can't know the purpose of God unless it's been revealed to us. There's a reference to it in first letter to the Corinthians, second chapter, 1 Corinthians chapter 2. And verse 9. As it is written, this is a quote from Isaiah 64 actually, but as it is written, eye hath not seen nor ear heard, neither have entered the heart of man the things which God has prepared for them that love him. Now sometimes that's misquoted as though we don't know what's going to happen. But then look at the next verse, but God hath revealed them unto us by his Spirit, for the Spirit searcheth all things, yea, the deep things of God. So these things, these things that eye hath not seen nor ear heard, is the unaided eye. The man could never have thought of it himself. They're unsearchable by man, but understandable by revelation. And God has condescended to reveal his purpose, and he's done it through his apostles and prophets, it says, by the Spirit. God has revealed it unto us by his Spirit. The Spirit searcheth, see, it searcheth, whereas we can't do it. It's unsearchable to us, but the Spirit searcheth all things, yea, the deep things of God, the depth of the riches of the wisdom, the deep things of God, things which were otherwise unsearchable, have been revealed. So we shouldn't say we can't understand them. What we should do is attend to the revelation that has been provided for us. Perhaps just conclude with a final reference from Romans. It's the 16th chapter, which just refers again to this unsearchable nature of the purpose of God and the way, in fact, it's been revealed. And it's verse 25. Now to him that is, this is how he concludes the epistle, him that is of power to establish you according to my gospel and the preaching of Jesus Christ, according to the revelation of the mystery, which was kept secret since the world began, but it now is made manifest, and by the scriptures of the prophets, according to the commandment of the everlasting God, made known to all nations for the obedience of faith. To God only wise be glory through Jesus Christ forever. So the glory that may be attributable to God is his condescension in revealing to us the mystery, revealing to us his purpose so that we can be part of it. And that's really how I'd just like to finish, how grateful we should be for this gracious revelation that we have of the purpose of God and how we can fit into it.